to jump right into the word. And what we're doing today is we're going to pick up where we left off last week. Really what part kind of message as we're talking about the disciples and their call from Jesus to follow him and would eventually become the apostles. So if you've been following it all in your Bibles, just so you know, you might look and go, well, Pastor's skipping around a bit. And you would be right. And good catch. And the reason I'm skipping around is because we're now moving into that part of Luke where, remember, as we learned early on in the series, he's trying to put together a very orderly kind of thing. So he's really working to put these things in the order in which they apparently happened, at least according to his records. And so the difficulty with that is that there are things that group together from a standpoint that work better together than just like, oh, here's a little section, then we go on another, you know what I'm saying? Like that gets hard to do from a teaching. Maybe someone who's much more skilled at that than I am would do better, but for me, I like to sort of group things together. And so it was very easy as we were starting out chapter 5 and talking about the call of Peter and his brother and the sons of Zebedee and all of that. It was just easier to say, let's just talk about the call of the disciples as a whole through chapters 5 and 6. You see what I'm saying? We will reference, and we're not going to ignore the miracles that Jesus did if there are lessons to learn, but we are getting into those things like, okay, he healed here, he healed there. Can I just tell you a little secret? It's really hard. It's like getting to Easter next week, okay? I've been a pastor for 41 years, and I don't know about you, but I don't know how to make Easter exciting after 41 years. Can I just tell you the truth? All right? I don't know how to make some of these passages exciting when it's like, Jesus healed a cripple, Jesus healed a leper, I don't know how to make those exciting anymore. They are what they are. So we are into the part of the book where we will probably be putting things together and gaining the bigger oversight and the lessons to be learned. Everybody understand? Just so you know why we're doing or what this crazy guy up here is doing. All right. It's interesting because Luke actually mentions more of the calls of the disciple. Now, Matthew and Mark do mention here and that. They do mention it, but Luke really sort of taps into these stories a little bit deeper. The only other, so far last week, we're going to look at Matthew today, and the only other one that we have any interaction with in all four of the Gospels, and it's the Apostle Philip. And all we know about Philip is this. He was sitting under a tree. That's all we know. That's all we know. All right? We might know other apostles. I think one of the more famous apostles in the church any length of time would be Thomas, and often he gets the unfortunate moniker of being Doubting Thomas. So unless an apostle had these really unique things or these parts of the stories that were important, we don't really know a lot about them as a whole. We just don't. Other than outside records from other sources in the church and that kind of thing. But in the biblical record, we don't know a lot. So through 5 and 6, I've taken these things and sort of pulled them together to make a cohesive 2-part message. And so we're going to look at that second part today. Does that sound good? The other thing I want to say about today's message, oftentimes, like last week, there are lots of lessons. You know, there are lots of lessons because there's deeper things going on. Speaking of deep, one of the last week is what it means to go into the deep. I was really blessed. On Monday morning, Kathy reached out, and she's like, you'll never believe what was in my devotional this morning. And the whole thing was, go out into the deep. And it was a wonderful encouragement and just really good. Even my wife said to me after the sermon last week, she goes, man, I was ready to go. I was really charged up. And I'm like, oh, well, great. I ignited faith in at least one person. In this case, it was my wife. So I was really excited about that. But anyway, so though we've had those kind of lessons, this one doesn't really have that kind of lessons. I'm trying to give you an idea of the climate. I'm trying to give you an idea now of sort of some of the broader issues going on, of what was going on in Jesus' ministry, why these people become important, and sort of why Luke puts them in there. And so we're looking at much broader strokes in today's message than a whole bunch of little pieces of application. Does that make sense? No or yes? All right. Sure. Thank you, Dan. I heard that all the way up here. Thank you. All right. So let's hit it. I want to start out today by talking about tax collectors and sinners. Anybody in here one of those? All right, 10 of you. The rest of you are lying. Okay. You're just lying. All right. Yeah, tax collectors and sinners. That's what we all are. There are those who get super spiritual and, I'm not a sinner anymore. Oh, yes, you are. Until Jesus comes back, you're going to wrestle with your flesh. You're going to need his grace. And just like that psalm this morning, you're going to have to stand in awe of the fact that he even chooses to deal with you because of his great love and his forgiveness, right? I mean, that's the reality that we all live in. You know, that idea that we have become so righteous. I've heard people say over the years, I've reached a point. Boast is sin. I mean, you're already screwing up. You know what I'm saying? I mean, just that boast is just arrogant to the max. So that reality is just going to be upon us until Jesus comes. That's why we need him, right? So I want to talk about that today because this broad stroke today that I just described is this idea that Jesus begins his main ministry. Obviously, he's done some healing and around. We've talked about that. But now he's starting to really gather followers. His fame has spread throughout Nazareth, throughout those areas. His fame is spreading. Followers are starting to come and be around. And he's now encountering more and more people who, at the very minimum, have heard of this guy who's healing people, who's teaching around Jerusalem and around Israel and all of that kind of stuff. They've at least heard of him. And in most cases, probably some have even heard him speak. Either they were close by or they've heard, they were in the crowd at one point. All of those kind of things are going on. So it talks about in Luke 4 that Jesus' fame sort of spread, right? So that's where we're at. But here's what's interesting compared to all the religious leaders of the time. The people that Jesus is going to, the people that Jesus is talking to, all these people that are known as tax collectors and sinners. The religious people just don't interact with those people. They're too religious. They're too holier than thou. They are those people who think they're beyond sin and look at how righteous their lives are. And man, if you would just follow their example, I mean, that's the religious leaders. Those are the Pharisees and those kind of teachers of the law that Jesus is always coming up against. So we see something because these Pharisees assumed that when the Messiah came, in Jewish understanding, he was going to come to them. Almost like they would. And now here's this Messiah. Tax collectors and sinners. Not the righteous. If anything, he's always righteous. And to put that in air quotes, because they're righteous in their own eyes, right? But not righteous in God's eyes, yeah? So we're going to talk about that. I want to talk a little bit, and again, we could talk on this for many, many sessions, but we're not going to just stay in the context of where we are. But I want to give you two quotes this morning. The first quote is from Mark Twain, and he's credited for having spent considerable time with good people. I can understand why Jesus liked to be with tax collectors and sinners. Let that sink in for a second. I don't actually know Mark Twain in terms of his spiritual idea, if he's speaking that as a believer or a non-believer. I don't know all that. I don't know that I care. What I care about is the fact that I think no matter who you are, if you've been in the church any length of time, you can relate to this statement. It's funny. One of the things in my departure is that the board and I have been saying to each other, we want to do this well. But can I just tell you that I have spent 41 years ministering to pastors, and they describe it as this. Instead of the right hand of fellowship, which is sort of right out of the Bible, at least one translation of the Bible, they're saying, I got the left foot. Happened. Everybody that they thought who was their friend or their brother and sister, they somehow turned on them. And now they were all enemies. And now they were fighting. I don't know about you. I have enough experience being a Christian since I've been 19. I have enough experience to know that I'd love to say that God's people handle everything well, but can I just tell you, really, truly, that they don't? Anybody know what I mean? They just don't. They just don't. People who, if they have been taught the word, and if they're really believers in Christ, if they're really followers, you would think that they would gain more and lean more into the Spirit, but they don't. They lean more into the flesh and into the carnal because of their own fears and their own insecurities and their own hurts and their own expectations being let down. And instead of saying, I'm going to live in the Spirit, they often live in the flesh. I'm not saying that every leader that leaves a place did it right. I'm not saying that. But I am saying I don't think it always has to go to pot. I think that's a carnal way to think about things. It's just a carnal way to think about things. Because what you're saying is that God is not big enough and we're all not mature enough to do this the right way. That's what you're saying. I mean, you need to think about what you're saying. So when you say to me, well, people are going to leave, I'm like, who do you believe in? Because I don't believe in those kind of people. I believe that people know what they're doing, and I believe people want a genuine body, and I believe this is a genuine body, so I have nothing negative to say. So why are you going down that path? Well, I have experience. Well, maybe that's not the only experience that there is. Because I've had good experiences. And I've seen other leaders in churches go through good experiences. So why are you assuming that your experience is the only one that matters? Do you see what I'm saying? So this is the reality that we're talking about, is that sometimes God's people are actually not the easiest people to love. They're not the friendliest people that you've ever met. And they're not really living that much different from everybody else out there. Especially when the world looks and says, oh, that's a church split. You think the world doesn't understand what that means? Because they do. So here's Jesus. These are the people. He's not coming then to the righteous who were messing everything up. He's coming to the tax collectors and the sinners. That's who he's coming to. That's the big stroke. That's the big brush this morning. Mahatma Gandhi, I've used this before, but I haven't said it exact, so here's the exact. His credit was saying, I like your Christ, when he was confronted by some American missionaries, but I do not like your Christian. These are not good statements from the world either way about who we are. And I don't think that these are isolated. You might, oh, well, that was a long time ago. You know what? Why don't we all pull out our phones right now and get some of our secular sinner friends on the phone and sort of see if they think any different. This isn't old stuff. I don't want to be negative, but I do want us to have sort of a wake-up call in the sense of, you know what, how we behave as sinners who are saved by grace by an ultra-loving God. It doesn't always translate, unfortunately. We're not always being as obedient and as faithful to the Word and to the Spirit as we could be. And so the world sees that. And yet these are the people that Jesus went to. Because the righteous thought, just like I've explained, they thought they could control things. They thought that they were holier than thou, and that somehow they weren't sinners. You know what? They thought that they were just better than everybody else. And yet they were just horrible people, honestly, with too much power. And Jesus saw them for what they are and actually called them a brood of what? Vipers. Snakes. I don't know about you. I think if today of vipers, I'd be highly offended at that. I would be looking in my spiritual mirror real quick and going, what have we done wrong? But not these folks. And so Jesus went to the sinners and the tax collectors. Here's why. Well, not why, but here's what I think is going on and I think we can relate to today. Number one, unbelievers are comfortable in their sin. You know what that means when I say pretense? They're comfortable in their skin most of the time. And Christians, we play these stupid, silly games with each other. What can I hide? How can I dress up for Sunday morning but live like the devil every other day? Come on, gang. Most of you have been around long enough. You know what I'm talking about. You've been in enough churches, you've seen this kind of stuff going on. You know, it's uncomfortable for Christians to gather together because we're putting up so many walls that we don't want anybody to look that deeply. As people who should be the most accountable people on the planet, accountable people on the planet. It's why leaders get abusive. It's why people fall into sin. It's why we go it alone because, again, I said, don't let anybody see, really. Because if they saw us, like we read this morning in Psalm 130, that says, you know what, God is forgiving, and God is loving, and God draws us in. Or are we really under that pretense that somehow we're going to be judged and treated differently than to deal with the fact that we really are sinners saved by grace? So if a person is dealing with pornography and they have to feel like they've got to put up a pretense around God's people instead of being able to say, hey, I'm struggling, I need help. Will you love me through that, or will you judge me? How many times do we need people, just like Jesus said to Peter, you know what, lift up your head and don't be afraid. How can we be that kind of a body? How can we be those kind of Christians so that people actually, sinners and tax collectors, can actually find Jesus instead of judgment? Because unless I'm mistaken, for those of us who truly have a relationship with Jesus, man, I don't know that I feel judgment from Jesus. I don't know that I could ever, I put it on myself. But what I hear from Jesus is, don't be afraid. Why are you running? Come back to me. I love you. Right? But too many of us have these pretenses up. Sinners didn't have that. As a matter of fact, we're going to see now. He didn't even care. He threw a party. And he invited all his tax collector friends. All we know about Matthew is that he was collecting me, and the next thing we know, the next thing we read is, oh, and Matthew threw a party. What were we all? A sinner party? Are they going to have alcohol? Are they going to, what? Not Matthew. He's like, Jesus, come on in, and I want you to meet all my friends. We have too much, dear ones. Number 4, they're unbelievers and come by their hypocrisy honestly. Many believers who live in denial of their own. About sinners. I've told you stories about my family. You know how broken it is, and even to this day, I don't have a relationship with my youngest brother to my own or my desire. Now finally have a relationship. We've not mended. I reached out to my brother in a time of need, and that changed his heart. And now he calls me, which is like, in my 60 years of living, has never happened. But now he's like, I'm thinking about you. I wanted to call you. Only because I reached out when he wasn't expecting, just to meet his need, his hurt with my niece, his daughter. But that changed the relationship. It totally switched it around to something I really wanted, but didn't know how to manufacture, if I can put it that way. But just loving him and not judging him brought him back into a relationship that I've wanted and longed for. But he's as unsaved as they come. He's as lost as a goose in a hailstorm, I think. You know what I mean? He's like, we were on the phone the other day, and he's like, yeah, I'm out with my friends drinking and partying until 1 o'clock. He tells me about all of his homosexual friends and how he feels about that. And so all of this stuff going on, and yet we will stay on the phone for an hour. And I just get to love on him. I don't judge what he tells me. There's no pretense with him. He is who he is. He's fine with who he is. He loves his sin. I don't have to put up any walls. And it's wonderful. Really, it's wonderful. Can you understand where Jesus is here? Can you understand what he's dealing with? Because these righteous people, all that pretense, all that wall, all that show, all that hypocrisy, at least unbelievers are just good with their honest hypocrisy. But not us. We just are in denial that we don't have any. Again, what's hypocrisy? That idea that says in Psalm 130, hey, we've received forgiveness, but I just want you to know, if you confess a sin in my small group, I just want you to know that won't be your case. Right? And I'm not saying that happens here, but come on, again, you have church experiences outside of HBIC, most of you. You understand that this is real life. You probably have friends who have told you this stuff goes on in their churches. Right? You've seen it. This isn't that far of a stretch. And what is going on in this context, yeah? All right, number 5. So let's talk specifically about tax collectors and how they fit into this sinner category. Tax collectors were known, and these words are actually found in Scripture to define them in the original language, as extortionists, hucksters, corrupt, and without character. And in the Jewish mindset, they were okay with that as long as they lined their pocket. There was no pretense. They knew if they became a tax collector, they would get wealthy. And they would do it on the backs of their countrymen. They knew that they had the authority to line their pockets. And even though Rome charged a certain limit, the truth is, from all that we know, most, if not all, tax collectors charges way above that amount. So they gave Rome what was due Rome when Jesus says, give to Caesar what's Caesar, but they kept a whole bunch in their pockets that wasn't Caesar's, that they just charged. Some of the things about old tax collectors is, and why they were so hated in Israel, is the fact that they could collect taxes anywhere they wanted to. So most cities back then were walled and gated. So what would the tax collectors do? They'd stand at the front gate, and the first thing that you saw when you entered a new city was a tax collector standing there ready to collect tax from you. It's now the tax to enter whatever city you're running into. They could interrupt and set up tax collecting anywhere, including at the temple gates. That's how much authority they had throughout Israel. I just paid my taxes, and I have a really friendly relationship with my tax collector, by the way. And I don't see her as a huckster or corrupt. I see her as very friendly and very nice and someone that I can reach out to. And so when I go in, we usually engage tax bill because I want to be in relationship with this person. But you have to understand who Jesus is associated with. These were not people that anybody held in esteem whatsoever. All right? Not at all. So now, that background and that understanding of just sort of thinking about what Jesus is doing here and why the righteous, the Pharisees all were so worked up, let's look at the call of Levi. Here's something interesting. Levi is the Matthew. Matthew is written by this person. Levi is his Hebrew name. And Luke is his doesn't change meaning or do anything. It's just a reality that Luke is writing to both, what have we said, both Jew and Gentile alike. And so he's just always taking the opportunity to connect the Jewish part of things for those Jewish readers. And so Levi, let's see if you know this name from the Old Testament, those of you who are a little more involved. Where do you hear Levi in the Old Testament? Okay, but what else about the Levites? Priests. Very good. This is Matthew's descendancy. It's from the tribe of Levi. All right? That idea that he and his tribe would have ministered in the temple, all of those things going on, that's all changed a little bit as time has gone on. But that's why Luke uses this connection. Because all of a sudden, someone who actually has a genuine claim to minister on behalf of the temple is now about to become a follower of Jesus. He's now about to become a follower of Jesus. So that's why Luke uses the name, but for all intent and purposes for us, it's Matthew. So let's read it so we see it in Luke 5. And you can have it on your devices as well. So after this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him. This. And Levi got up, left everything. Throwing himself down. Jesus saw him collecting taxes, walked over to him, said, "Follow me." He got up and followed him. Okay. Let's talk about that a little bit to put it in context. Matthew was collecting taxes nearby where Jesus was conducting a healing meeting. Matter of fact, one of the most famous miracles just took place. Does anybody know which one? Who's been reading? Lower down through the roof. That miracle just happened. So it's very possible that Matthew could have been set up nearby. He either heard the commotion, he saw people being healed. All of that was happening. All right, so that's why it says after this. Jesus just finished all these miracles. One of those that we know about, we'll talk about in future weeks, is this one of this person being lowered down by his friends on a mat. All of that just happened. So again, remember what I said earlier. It's possible that most of these people have either heard of Jesus by now, or were close by when things were happening, or saw people who were touched by that, and Matthew easily could have been one of them. And it may be why we don't have more information, because Matthew was sort of already primed for the pump, if you will. You know what I mean? We don't know that. I'm just sort of adding that in, but that's on here as it's saying after this. So what's after? It's after all this miracles happening and then this encounter. And because Luke is putting it in order, Luke is making sure that these things aren't happening necessarily over weeks and months. Some of these events happen within that kind of time of each other. I mean, like instantly. All right? So that's sort of what's happening. So let's keep reading here, verse 29. Then, remember I said, as soon as Levi followed, what happened? For Jesus, a crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. The Pharisees belonged to their sect. But the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Does all this the context start to make sense? All of this is happening. All of what Jesus is trying to accomplish here is happening. So let's talk a little bit more about Matthew and sort of what's going on and why they're so hated. Number one, to become a tax collector, usually one has just a franchise, right? Restaurants or franchises. You buy into that from a corporate and you sort of get your own thing. Well, that was normally, it wasn't 100% what to buy in. In order to buy in, one of the things that often happened in the transactions is that they would sell their land because they couldn't afford it otherwise, even rich. You know, really the only thing that had a value was land. And you wouldn't have cash, you would have given up something very tangible and real. And so in order to buy the Roman government, and what the Roman government desired more than anything else, all right, believe it or not, land. Because the more land that they claimed, ownership they said they had of whatever people they've conquered. Does that make sense? Now, into the shoes of a Jew. So we're all Jewish people. We all own a piece of this earth that's called Israel. We could say we're all Americans, and we all own our acreage or whatever we own. If we own property, we own our plot in America. Right? If all of a sudden, several of us decided we would just Now, that's part of America. Imagine when you have grown up all your life as a Jew, God's chosen, but the land that he gave to you, he called out over the whole earth and said, this plot I have determined. No plot I'm giving to you. And what happens when all of a sudden that they believe out of land, the person to no one worse or to who were despised and hated. And one of the reasons that tax collectors were so despised is because to most people, and it's there, oftentimes it's sold off to buy, like selling their birthright. If you know the story of Jacob and Esau, you know that term. So they have biblical history with that. They understand that. And now that's really happening. And so to them, you are treason. It's worse than treason in the Jewish mind. This is why tax collectors were so hated. This is why they were so hated. All right? This is why. Because all of this stuff. So Matthew would have been one of these people. So didn't just go just. I mean, he went to tax collectors. He went to those who already sold their inheritance. That to their countrymen, they're just there is no lower. There just is no lower. I mean, they don't just live on the other side of the tracks. They live under the tracks. I mean, there's just no lower. And yet this is who Jesus befriends and calls his own. Y'all with me so far? So just to give you... So in the eyes of Jews then, oppressed their own people, despised their heritage, and renounced God. And they were considered by their countrymen no worse than harlot, or the same as harlots. The greatest of sinners. This is who Jesus called. This is who Matthew was. And what is absolutely awesome to me as someone who loves the Word is the fact that this is the man who wrote the first gospel. That's how changed his life was. That's how much Jesus changed him. And it was no small feat for other Jews to come into the kingdom and to see and know who Matthew was and say, if you're going to be part of this kingdom, then forgiveness is your first order of business. And to whom has been forgiven, much is required. And so I just want you to know, if you're coming into this kingdom, I want you to know that the people that I think are closest to me are already sinners and tax collectors. And so if you can be okay with them, then you can be okay with this kingdom. Let me think about that really. That's why so many people, particularly those who have an apostolic gifting, they'll go to the hard places. They'll go to the streets of New York City where most of us would never think about going. They'll go into places. They're going into, Michigan and those places where there's large concentrations of Muslims right now in America. They're going into these places that are full of sinners and tax collectors just to say, Jesus loves you. And when he was on this earth, this is who he hung out with. When he was on this earth, this is who he wanted in his inner circle. And we just want you to know that there's lots of hope for you. I think that's personally, as a believer. Yeah? Y'all with me? So, here's the thing. Matthew knew who he was. There wasn't any pretense in that. He knew. Like I said, he threw a banquet. Now, part of that is that it would be cultural when a person, a teacher, or somebody visits to have a banquet. But the fact that Matthew just invited all of his friends was crazy. And he didn't just invite all of his friends. He invited Jesus and all of his friends, too. I mean, this was a big shindig. Matthew had the means to do it, obviously, at that time. So he did. But this is who Matthew was and what he did. We sing a song. I don't know if Kayla's in here can remind me of the title, but that's who he was. What is that song we sing? This is our God. Yeah, we sing it. Oh, this is Matthew right here, like playing that out. This is who I am. But God loves this. And yet, even with that. Leave it to the righteous. Leave it to the righteous who think they're so good. Here's this wonderful thing. Sinners are getting saved. Sinners are meeting Jesus. Jesus is eating with them, sharing who he is, and leave it to the righteous to ruin the whole shebang. Those who think they're so good, so mighty, so perfect. Let them be the ones that have the negativity. Let them be the ones with the complaints. Let them be the ones who go to the carnal side instead of celebrating that lives are being changed. All they're concerned about is that they don't have control. They don't have control. So just like Peter, who said, go, Matthew knew who he was as a sinner and still responded to Jesus' invitation of follow me. Follow me. Remember I said we're in broad strokes? Guys, when's the last time you said to a sinner, would you consider following Jesus? I mean, really, when's the last time? I think I do stand amazed that one of the things I probably hear from Christians, not just here, everywhere, is the fact that most people can't even remember the last time they would have brought Jesus up in normal. Remember I told you about my conversation, I've had several now over the last couple months with my brother, but I told him when all of this was announced that I was stepping out, and he was shocked, like maybe many of you were. And the first thing he said is, he said, Brian, there's no one else on this planet that I know who is as good as you, who is as kind as you, who is giving up his life for what everyone else needs. And he finally said, brother, I'm just glad to see that maybe in this season you get to do something different. Though I appreciate his encouragement, what I appreciate more is that he understood that Jesus has changed my life. He sees in me what he doesn't fully understand, but he sees a change. He will often tell me, as a matter of fact, he just told me that one of his sons and family are starting to take their little one to church, and he's like, you need to go to my brother's church, because I don't know anybody nearly as good as that. And I appreciate that. They haven't been here yet, so I don't know if they're coming or not. But it's just that reality. He recognizes in my relationship, because I've never compromised. I've never wanted to give in to my hypocrisy. What I want to do is always have the door open to bring Jesus into normal conversation. And I do that with my brother. I do that with my brother. I don't have any pretenses. I'm not preaching at him. But when he makes a comment, I have no problem saying, I just know that Jesus has changed my life. I want him to know why he thinks what he thinks. Whether he fully understands is important, but I need to bring Jesus in. And gang, that probably, and I'm not very evangelistic. It's one of my weakest gifts. Like, it's at the bottom of my totem pole. So this isn't just about being or having that gift, because Paul teaches us to do the work of an evangelist. That means sharing Jesus, bringing Jesus into normal conversation. And that's what Jesus did. This is the broad stroke today. It is the lesson that we all need to weigh out before the Spirit and say, hey, would you give me the boldness just to bring Jesus into normal conversation? We have bought into so many lies that somehow we can't even say his name. We have bought into lies in our workplace that just anybody else could have a normal conversation with no pretense in the workplace. They could even give devil praise and no one would say anything. But we have bought into the lie and the deception that the minute we say Jesus, we've done something wrong. And that isn't the case. I have never seen that in all my years. Now, if you decide you're going to start preaching in the workplace, you might have a different problem. But for you to simply say, hey, I went to church because my relationship with Jesus is important, that's just a fact. It is just who you are. But are you doing those things? Are you bringing Jesus into the normal conversation? Are you, and I would assume all of us, including myself, are interacting with tax collectors and sinners, if you will, and are you bringing Jesus into that conversation? Because that's what Jesus did. He brought it into the conversation. Y'all with me so far? All of Jesus' disciples, every one of them, story about this, which we end with in verse 32. I have not come to call this, but sinners to repentance. Guys, that's what this is about now. Some of you have been saved long enough. Man, you just need to bring Jesus in. You don't have to preach. You don't have to judge. none of that belongs to you. You do understand that it's the Holy Spirit that draws, right? You do understand you don't have to take any of that weight on. I have no weight where it comes to my brothers. I had no weight when it came to my parents. I just stayed faithful and brought Jesus into normal conversation. I remember, I've told this story before, but I remember a time when my mom was still with us. She was sick. She was in the hospital. Many of you remember she had a disease that affected her whole body. And she was in the hospital because it was out of control. And I remember being in the hospital with her, and I remember which was great. And I knew where she was at all times. At the moment, she reaches out to me, and as we're sitting there, and she says, "Why does Jesus hate me so much?" Just normal. And at that moment, I get the opportunity to express to her the love of Jesus, and that Jesus doesn't dislike her or hate her or have anything against her, that none of this is actually his fault at all. That we live in a broken world, and Mom, what we need is more of Jesus because everything's so broken, because we're so sick, because we're so diseased. What we need is more of him, not because he hates us, but because he loves us. See, can you just bring that into normal conversation? Just bring it into normal conversation. My experience is that people will be really respectful of that. That's my experience. Because I don't preach at them. I let them talk, and I talk. Oftentimes, even in counseling, I'll counsel people who are not necessarily or following Jesus. And I'm like, I just want you to know I'm going to bring Jesus into our conversation because that's my background. That's what I know. So as long as you're okay with that, then we're going to keep going. If you're not okay with that, and I'm not preaching at them, but I just want them to know I'm going to respond from a place of truth because they need truth. They don't need my opinion. They need truth, right? So you just bring Jesus into normal conversation. All right, so let's go on. Let's move on because I think yeah? All right. Luke 5:39. Here is now another instance that happens pretty quickly. Not quite as fast as the other one where Jesus went from the healing to Matthew, but then what we know is that probably it happened within about 24 hours of all of these other things taking place. So what's happened is they've had a party, they're doing all of those things, and so then they said to him, John's disciples, this is this criticism that we mentioned earlier of the Pharisees, John's disciples often fast and pray, disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking, because they're still there, they're still having this party. And you have to understand that when they had a banquet wasn't a 2-hour thing because we're all so busy and we want to move on. All right, this was probably a week-long affair. All right, I'll explain. All right, so they go on eating and drinking. Jesus answered, can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? Well, the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days, they will fast. So what's a parable? Something that's set by side. It's a real comparison to help us understand. All right, Dan made a great one today. All right, in our leaders thing, those things we can set side by side. So he told them this parable: there's a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new one will not match the old. Wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking, where they say the old is better. Now, there's a lot going on. Here's a party. Here's it going on. He's using incredible language in here that we need to look at. We need to understand the context of what's just been said and sort of finish out our day. You ready? All right, go. So, number one, Matthew throws a feast to introduce Jesus to more sinners, and the Pharisees find more to criticize, in this case, the fasting. Because it was normal for Pharisees in that day to fast several times a week. which is really funny. They've gotten so religious because the law only required them to fast, I think, once a month. But now they're doing it 2, 3, 4 times a week to show how righteous they are. One of those law books things that no one else, not even God, required of them, but that's what they're criticizing right now, all right? But here's how Jesus responds. Jesus' bridegroom statement, verse 34 and 35, are the one that you would glance over and not think much about. As feasts were a 7-day event of celebration and not a time of fasting or labor. So here they're criticizing, why are your disciples partying when they should be doing the righteous thing, right? That's the criticism. And Jesus responds and says, would you ask a bridegroom? Because in Jewish culture, a bride, a wedding, is mandated to be 7 days. Now, parents, if you've ever paid for a wedding, how would you like to pay for 7 days? All right? You pay for one open bar and you're going to be broke. You understand what I'm saying? So 7 days here, all right? And that was customary. So Jesus using that terminology was terminology that both the Pharisees, all those listening, and certainly those who would read Luke's account would understand very quickly. Because that idea is, you know what? We're in a time where who is with them? The bridegroom. Christ, right? That's his title. If we're the bride, he's the bridegroom. He's telling them something very deeply spiritual here for the first time that they didn't even think about. Important. I'm the bridegroom, and we're in our celebration. Really, it'll be longer than 7 days. It'll be 3 years. There's going to be a time, he's now prophesying, without someone saying, oh, he's prophesying. He's prophesying, saying there's going to be a time where the bridegroom isn't present anymore. It's the first time that he alludes to his leaving. First time in the ministry so far that he alludes to his leaving. There's going to be a time. The Pharisees heard it. His disciples heard it. No one got it. But he is letting them know already. Time's coming. And the bridegroom's not going to be present. Not in the way that you think. Right? That's what's going on here. That's why that term is there. Does that make sense? All right, because again, in a casual reading, you would just go over all that, right? You just bypass it. All right, number 3 there. So then he goes from that. So he sets the stage of who he is. He sets the stage very quickly in answering why they're not doing the righteous thing, all right, in a cultural way that everybody understands it. He's very wise. Do you know that our God is extremely wise? Did anybody stop and think about that? If you really want wisdom to how to handle stuff, maybe you ought to go to the Word, because he's pretty smart. Just saying. Okay, and so he's pretty smart. And so Jesus really here is just that, using all this to his advantage very quickly. And so here's what's happening. Jesus' wineskin now, he goes into this parable, one of his first, to compare the old way of legalism that the Pharisees know, compared to the new way of joy Jesus' followers now know. That's what he's setting side by side. Here's the parable of cloth. I don't know. I'm not a sewer. All right? But I think I've learned enough that if you take clothing and put it on, that something's going to shrink, right? So if you patch it in some way, and then you wash it, and that particular patch hadn't been weathered and washed and all that, it's not going to go right. That's what he's referring to here. They washed clothes too. They understood that analogy, all right? And they would have sewed a lot more than most of us do anymore, right? They would have understood that very quickly. And he's comparing that now to this legalism, this righteousness that the Pharisees want to bring into this thing, instead of understanding the joy that Matthew, the disciples, that those who are at this party are feeling in knowing Jesus. And he's putting those two parables side by side on display. That's why we can call it a parable. And he's saying, you know what, Pharisees, you're stuck in this legalism where there's no joy, there's only performance, there's only pretense, there's nothing in that that's life-giving. But I want you to know that in this new way, in the new covenant, there is joy unending. There is freedom for those who have been lost in sin. There is freedom to the captive. There is a new way, and that way is full of the joy of heaven. And that's what's on display here. That's exactly what's going on. Y'all with me? So it's really important. Again, we sort of bypass some of the details, but to understand what Jesus' ministry and what's really going on, I think it's important to look. I love this passage. I've used it a lot recently. For his anger lasts only a moment, in Psalm 35. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Man, that's so good here. That works so well. There was a time of mourning. There was a time of longing for the bridegroom. There was a time of needing the Messiah, but the Messiah is here. And that time, that night, that morning is over. And right now, this is a time of joy and celebration. It is a feast. It is the wedding feast because right now, the bridegroom is out to reestablish or establish the body of Christ, his bride, and call her home. Man, that gives me God bumps right there. Yeah? So Jesus is the bridegroom, and there are always those who want to hang on. You know, how many times have you been in a church, can't get rid of the pews, you got to hold. We can't go to contemporary songs, we got to hold on to the hymns. Who said? You? You get to make that call all by yourself. I don't know about you, but that new song that Kayla and the team introduced today, it sounded more like a hymn, just like any of the old ones that I know. What's wrong with that? Right? I mean, you see, but there's always those who want to hold on to what is old without coming into the new. That's part of the challenge that we have right now in this country where Christianity is concerned, is you have this generation that says, we have seen your hypocrisy, and we're tired of your hypocrisy, so we don't want anything to do with your Christ, just like Gandhi. We don't want anything to do with your Christ. But all of a sudden, we just got the latest numbers. There's a new movement arising, and it's coming from the young people who are saying, we want something real and authentic. And we thought we just wanted spirituality, but we are finding that we actually want Jesus. But we want the authentic Jesus, not the Jesus of pretense. Not the Jesus of the old way and the old things and the old doings, but we want the Jesus of the new way. The Jesus of joy, the Jesus that's real. And that means that the church that we knew may not be the church that will be. But it will be the church. It will be the church. It will be God's people. And so some of us who are so stuck, and listen, I'm old enough now, I'm in that baby boomer generation, and so I understand. You know, if you come into my man cave at home, you know, you're going to see all the stuff from when I was a kid kind of thing. You know, you're going to see Lego sets and Star Wars. You're going to see Peanuts and old 60s Batman stuff. Because I've been around long enough to want that nostalgia. But it's old. You know, my son says to me, like, Dad, I don't want any of that stuff. Get rid of that stuff. I don't want any of that. Because it's old. But then we sit with my son and his daughter, or my son and his wife, and my daughter-in-law, and we have these incredibly, deeply... Honestly, Jane and I usually walk away, and our minds are blown because they are working through this thing of this Jesus in being authentic and what it means to them. And they are full of all this wisdom of God and the Word. And we're just astounded. And we're like, man, it looks so different than what we're even comfortable with. And I'm usually good with new stuff, but it still looks really different. But I see Jesus. I see Jesus. And that's Jesus' whole parable here, is that idea that, you know what? There might have been thousands of years of Jewish history, and we appreciate all that. And I'm not here to cancel out all of that, Jesus said. I'm here to fulfill it. But it is going to look new. Because if anything you should have learned by now, Pharisees, is that doing the same thing over and over is not getting different results. It's only making you more wicked. And so I'm bringing in something new. And honestly, I believe that if the church, at least in America, is going to survive, it's going to have to be new again. Not the old, but the new. And those of us who aren't on board, you just need to get out of the way then and shut up. Right? I mean, really. And I'm not saying that we're not following the word, and I'm not saying all that, but it's just tradition. And so maybe it won't be like clockwork in the new season that says, oh, we're going to sing 3 or 4 songs and pray, announce, quick 20-minute message and go home. Maybe it will be totally different. And that's okay, because there's nothing in the word that says it has to look like that. You just made it up. I just made it up. We do what we do because I know you're comfortable with it. But you also should know me by now that if there's something new to do, we'll do it, right? That's what's going on. That's why this is important. Y'all with me so far? All right, one last point. We're going to stop. Gang, as we talked about sinners and tax collectors today, there will always be those who reject the true message of joy and freedom that Christ brings. There will always be those who say, no, thank you. I'm not interested. I remember the first time that I reached out. It was back in the early 2000s, 2001, I think. I wrote my mom a letter. And it's the first time that I ever actually just shared the salvation message with her. I've talked about Jesus. I'd never just sat down the Spirit at that point in my life. And I wrote about a two or three page letter, and I really explained the gospel message to my mom. All right, at that point, she wasn't following Jesus. And basically every week, at some level, at the most 2. About a month and a half before I even brought it up. I didn't even want to pressure her or do anything. I just wanted to leave it and allow the Holy Spirit to work. And finally, about a month and a half in, I was talking with her on the phone, and I said, Mom, about a month and a half ago, I know it was a different kind of letter, and I was wondering if you got it. Yeah, I got it. That's all she said. And now she had to be confronted by the truth that I wrote. And here was her response. I'm just not ready. And I simply said, that's fine, Mom. I just wanted you to know. And I love you. And we just... I didn't take it personal. It wasn't because it didn't belong to me. I did what was stirring in my spirit. And praise God, within the next 10 years, she would find Jesus on her own. That letter played, I have no idea. And I don't care. All I care about is... You see what I'm saying? And so, yeah, you know what? There are always going to be those who reject, but don't take it personally. Just start to make it part of your vocabulary to bring Jesus up in normal conversation. Not in a preachy way, but just when it is. I went to church. Oh, you go to church? Yeah. Anything else. That's all you need to say. They can decide to carry that conversation. They can decide. But that is true. But just saying, I go to church, does nothing. All that says to them is, oh, you're part of that hypocrisy group. You're part of a cult. You're part of whatever they think church is at this point. Right? I mean, do you all work with sinners like I do? Because that's what I deal with. Right? But if you bring Jesus up in that's a whole different thing. He's a real person. Reject, and they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting him. But it's a real thing. That's the lesson that you need to take away, is start saying, Holy Spirit, lead me in these kind of conversations. And just by doing it, you're going to become more comfortable doing it. But number 2, it's going to change you. You're going to think it's all about them, but it's all about you. Because when all of a sudden, conversation, number 1, it starts to develop a boldness in you. The Holy Spirit has access to move in that power, that dunamis power of Acts 1:8. But it also starts to change you in terms of, oh my gosh, I work with these people. They see me day to day. So when I lose it, but yet I want to bring Jesus in the normal, All right? If you think about how I'm behaving here, all of a sudden, that spiritual mirror is on you. It's on you. And that's one of the things that I have loved about it is as I've learned to do that, and I didn't always do that in my life, but as I've learned to do that, it makes me stop and think and say, oh, you know what? Like when I worked at Walmart for those couple of months, they knew. They knew. I didn't hide. It was normal conversation, but it made me a lot more accountable, a lot more. So when I lost it, and there were moments I lost it, I was like, oh, Jesus. I really just blew that. I wasn't a good representation, so thank you for reminding me of it. You see? See why this is important? Y'all with me today? I got to ask that question because if I don't, it's not a Brian sermon. All right? Helpful? All right. Very good. Well, we're going to stop there for time's sake. I'm going to call the worship team back up. I think who's ever coming up. We want the love of God. We want to just do it, and we think it's a very appropriate song for our time together next week during Easter. We will, the worship team won't be fully here, so we'll be doing tracks. And so we just wanted you to be familiar with this song before we introduce it on Easter Sunday. Is that okay?